In 1961, a clay tablet was discovered in the ruins of ancient Sumer that should not exist. Archaeologists found it buried beneath layers of sediment dating back over 4,000 years near the ancient city of Nippur in southern Iraq. The symbols etched into its surface were written in cuneiform, the oldest known form of writing. When scholars finally translated the text, they found something that made absolutely no sense for a civilization that supposedly never left the ground. The tablet contained detailed descriptions of the moon's internal structure. Not myths or poetry, actual architectural descriptions. Chambers with measurements, passageways with specific orientations, materials with properties that could be tested and verified. And most disturbingly, it described a massive entrance on the lunar surface that should not be visible to the naked eye. Yet somehow, the Sumerians knew exactly where it was. If you want to see more deep dives into forbidden history and ancient mysteries the mainstream won't touch, hit subscribe. I cover this every week, and next time we're breaking down the Egyptian texts that describe flying machines with specifications so precise that modern engineers have tried to build them. The tablet in question is cataloged as VAT 112772 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. It's not some fringe discovery. It's sitting in one of the most respected archaeological museums in the world, authenticated by multiple experts and carbon dated to the early 2nd millennium BCE. The chain of custody is documented. The provenance is verified. This is a legitimate Sumerian artifact. The problem is what it says. According to the translation completed by Dr. Hermann Hilprecht in 1903, and later re-examined by Samuel Kramer in 1944, the tablet contains what the Sumerians called the Tablet of Destinies. But this particular fragment doesn't deal with mythology. It deals with something the text calls the moon chamber. The tablet describes the moon as a hollow vessel, using the Sumerian term for constructed object, not celestial body. It states that inside the structure are 7 levels, each serving a different function. The outer shell, according to the text, is made of a material the Sumerians called celestial stone, described as harder than any metal, but lighter than water. Modern materials, science has a name for substances with those properties. We call them composite materials or aerogels. The Sumerians should not have known these even existed, but the tablet goes further. It describes internal chambers filled with what translates to glowing air. Not fire, not torches, not reflected sunlight, glowing air. The text specifies that this light does not burn, does not consume fuel, and does not fade over time. It exists in a state of permanent illumination. Modern physics recognizes this as a description of either bioluminescence, chemiluminescence, or some form of sustained plasma. All three require advanced understanding of energy states. In the third chamber, the tablet describes mechanisms that control the movement of the moon. The text uses terms that translate to gears, wheels, and interlocking systems made of the same celestial stone, arranged in patterns that maintain balance and regulate motion. The Sumerians knew the moon's orbit wasn't random. They knew it was too perfect, too stable, too circular to be the result of natural capture by Earth's gravity, and they claimed to know what maintained it. The mechanisms described in the tablet match what modern orbital mechanics would require to artificially stabilize a satellite. Gyroscopic stabilizers, counterweights, propulsion systems that make micro-adjustments over time. The kind of engineering that wouldn't be theorized by human scientists until the 20th century. The second chamber, according to the tablet, serves as what the text calls the breathing room. This section describes a system that generates atmosphere within the hollow moon. The Sumerians had no concept of atmospheric pressure or oxygen content, yet the tablet describes a process where certain stones, when exposed to the glowing air, release breathable gases. The text notes that without this chamber functioning, the other levels would become death rooms. Modern technology uses a similar process called electrolysis to separate oxygen from other compounds. Space stations use it to maintain breathable air for astronauts. The International Space Station has a system called the Oxygen Generation System that splits water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. The Sumerians described this process 4,000 years before we put it into practice. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable for conventional archaeology. The tablet doesn't describe this as mythology. It describes it as a record. The text begins with a phrase that translates to as witnessed by the eye, not as told by the gods, not as revealed in dreams, as witnessed, first-hand observation. The tablet claims that Sumerian priests were taken inside the moon by beings they called the Anunnaki, and what they saw inside changed their understanding of the cosmos forever. The Anunnaki appear in hundreds of Sumerian texts spanning over 1,500 years. Mainstream scholars classify them as deities. But if you read the descriptions without the religious filter, the Anunnaki don't behave like gods. They eat, they sleep, they bleed. They age slowly, which the texts attribute to something called the food of life. They build cities using materials and labor. They travel in physical vehicles that make sounds described as thunder. The Sumerian king list describes the Anunnaki as coming from the sky before the Great Flood and establishing kingship on earth. Their cities are named Eridu, Ur, Nippur. Their leaders are named Anu, Enlil, Enki. Their wars are documented, and in multiple texts, the Anunnaki are described as teaching humanity astronomy, mathematics, metallurgy, and written language. One of those secrets, according to VAT Awantwe 772, was the truth about the moon. The tablet states that the moon is not a natural celestial body. It's a construct, a vessel brought into Earth's orbit thousands of years before human civilization existed. The purpose, according to the text, was to stabilize the planet. Before the moon's arrival, the tablet claims the Earth wobbled violently on its axis, making sustained life nearly impossible. The Anunnaki placed the moon in orbit to create tidal forces, stabilize the axial tilt, and allow life to flourish. If this sounds insane, consider what modern astrophysics tells us. The moon is abnormally large for a satellite. Its size relative to Earth is a statistical outlier in our solar system. Its orbit is nearly circular, which is geometrically improbable for a captured object. And its composition doesn't match Earth's composition, which contradicts the dominant theory that the moon formed from debris after a planetary collision. There's another problem with the mainstream explanation. The giant impact hypothesis, the currently accepted theory, states that the moon formed when a Mars-sized object called Theia collided with Earth roughly 4.5 billion years ago. The debris from the impact coalesced into the moon. But this theory has serious issues that scientists quietly acknowledge in academic papers but rarely discuss publicly. First, if the moon formed from Earth's debris, its composition should match Earth's composition. It doesn't. Lunar samples collected by the Apollo missions show a completely different ratio of isotopes, particularly oxygen isotopes, which suggests the moon didn't originate from Earth material. The isotopic signature is wrong. Second, the moon's orbital mechanics don't fit the giant impact model. Computer simulations of the Theia collision show that the debris would have formed a ring system around Earth, similar to Saturn's rings, not a single consolidated satellite. To get the moon into its current orbit from a debris field, the simulations require multiple highly improbable adjustments and gravitational assists that have never been observed in any other planetary system. The math only works if you add variables that conveniently make it work. And third, the moon is receding from Earth at a rate of 3.8 centimeters per year. This recession is measured and verified. If you reverse that recession and calculate backward, the moon would have been in direct contact with Earth roughly 1.4 billion years ago, not 4.5 billion years ago, as the giant impact hypothesis requires. The timeline doesn't match, the composition doesn't match, the formation process doesn't match, yet this remains the accepted explanation because the alternative is too uncomfortable to consider. In 1969, NASA's Apollo 12 mission deliberately crashed the ascent stage of the lunar module into the moon's surface, to test seismic equipment that had been left behind by Apollo 11. The impact was equivalent to detonating 1 ton of TNT at a velocity of over 6,000 kilometers per hour. Seismometers placed at multiple locations across the landing site recorded the moon's response to the impact. What they detected shouldn't have been possible. The moon rang like a bell for over an hour, not a metaphor. The seismic waves reverberated through the lunar structure in a pattern consistent with a hollow or partially hollow object. The vibrations peaked at 55 minutes after impact and gradually declined over the next several hours. Dr. Ross Taylor, a geochemist who analyzed lunar samples brought back by the Apollo missions, reviewed the seismic data and stated publicly that the moon's behavior during the test suggested it might be hollow, or at minimum, that its internal structure was fundamentally different from Earth's. Dr. Frank Press from MIT, who designed some of the seismic equipment used in the Apollo program, noted that the ringing pattern was unlike anything observed in terrestrial geology. Solid planetary bodies absorb seismic energy. They don't amplify it. NASA never followed up on this finding with additional tests. The data was published in scientific journals, discussed briefly at a few conferences, then buried under decades of later research that focused on surface composition and crater analysis. But the Sumerians had already told us the moon was hollow 4,000 years earlier. The 7th chamber described in the tablet is called the Hall of Lights. According to the text, this chamber is located at the moon's core and serves as the control center. The walls are described as covered in star maps that glow from within the material itself. The maps show not just visible stars, but systems that cannot be seen without telescopes. One section shows a cluster the Sumerians called the Place of Origin, described as 7 sisters dancing in the void. Modern astronomers recognize this as the Pleiades. But the tablet doesn't just mention the Pleiades. It describes the cluster in geometric detail, noting star positions, brightness levels, and dimmer stars surrounding the main group. The Pleiades are 444 light-years from Earth. Without telescopes, the human eye can see only 6 or 7 of the brightest stars. But the tablet describes dozens of stars in patterns that match current astronomical maps. The Sumerians had no way to observe this level of detail, yet the tablet describes the cluster with precision not matched by human astronomers until the 17th century. Inside the Hall of Lights, the tablet describes a council chamber where the Anunnaki made decisions regarding Earth. The room is circular with a dome ceiling reflecting the star maps. At the center is a platform called the Seat of Judgment. The text claims humans were not allowed in this chamber, but Sumerian priests were permitted to observe from an outer passage, separated by a transparent barrier described as thinner than silk but harder than bronze. What they saw was a gathering of beings who did not look entirely human. The text notes elongated skulls, unusually tall stature, eyes that reflected light like polished metal, and skin with a faint luminescence, hands with longer fingers and an additional joint. These details match descriptions found in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis. The consistency across multiple sources is hard to dismiss, but the most controversial part of the tablet isn't what's inside the moon, it's what's on the surface. The text describes a doorway located on the southern region of the moon's visible face. Not a crater, not a rock formation, a doorway. The tablet provides specific landmarks to locate it, describing the door's position relative to 2 major craters identified as Tycho and Clavius. The text states the door lies between these landmarks, slightly offset toward the terminator line. It describes the door as framed by 2 pillars of celestial stone, each rising roughly 9 to 10 kilometers in height. Between the pillars is a recessed opening that remains sealed except when the Anunnaki choose to open it. The door is described as smooth, without hinges or visible mechanisms. To the ancient Sumerians, this wasn't mythology. It was cartography. They were giving directions. In 1994, the Clementine spacecraft orbited the moon and captured high-resolution images of the entire surface. The mission was a joint project between NASA and the Department of Defense, officially tasked with testing sensors for ballistic missile defense. But the images included something unexpected. In the southern polar region, in an area matching the landmarks described in the Sumerian tablet, researchers identified a formation that didn't match any known geological process. It appeared as two parallel structures rising from the surface, roughly 3 kilometers apart, with a recessed shadow between them. The formation was symmetrical, perfectly symmetrical. Natural geology doesn't create perfect symmetry. But this structure had clean edges, straight lines, parallel orientation. NASA classified the raw images and released only low-resolution versions to the public. The formation was explained as a crater with unusual lighting. But independent analysts who enhanced the images noticed something else. The shadows between the two pillars didn't behave like shadows cast by sunlight. They were too dark, too uniform, and too deep. It looked like an opening. In 2009, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter conducted another survey of the moon's south pole using laser altimetry and high-resolution cameras capable of resolving features smaller than 1 meter across. This time, the resolution was high enough to see details that Clementine had missed. When the LRO passed over the formation identified 15 years earlier, NASA released a statement saying the structure was a natural ridge caused by ancient volcanic activity billions of years ago. But the images told a different story. The two pillars were still there, still parallel, still symmetrical. And between them, the opening appeared even more defined than in the Clementine data. Researchers who analyzed the publicly available LRO data noted something troubling. The depth of the recess between the pillars couldn't be measured accurately because the laser altimetry sensors couldn't detect a floor. The lasers bounced back from the edges of the structure but returned no data from the center. Either the opening was too deep for the equipment to scan, extending beyond the maximum range of the instrument, or there was no floor to detect. Just empty space. NASA archived the data, and it hasn't been referenced in any major lunar studies since 2009. The formation appears in no geology textbooks. It's mentioned in no academic papers about lunar surface features. It exists in the data, verified and cataloged, but officially ignored. When independent researchers requested higher resolution imagery of the specific area, NASA denied the request, citing resource allocation priorities. The area has been photographed dozens of times by the LRO over the past 15 years, but none of those images have been made publicly available at full resolution. The Sumerian tablet describes the door as sealed by a mechanism that responds to sound. Specifically, a sequence of tones that the Anunnaki used to open and close the passage. The text claims that only those who know the sequence can enter, and that the sequence changes periodically to prevent unauthorized access. This detail seemed absurd to translators in the early 20th century. How could sound open a door made of stone? But in 2003, researchers at the University of California discovered that certain frequencies of sound can cause materials to change their molecular structure temporarily. The phenomenon is called acoustic levitation, and it's now used in laboratories to manipulate small objects without physical contact. Scientists have demonstrated that sound waves at specific frequencies can create standing wave patterns that exert physical force on objects, essentially suspending them in midair or moving them along predetermined paths. If a material could be engineered to respond to specific sound frequencies, changing its density or rigidity when exposed to the right tones, it could theoretically create a lock that operates without any mechanical parts, no hinges, no latches, no keys. Just sound. The Sumerians described this technology 4,000 years before we discovered the science behind it. And they described it not as magic or divine power, but as a mechanism, a tool, something that could be understood and replicated if you knew the principles. There's another problem with the mainstream explanation of the moon's origin. The giant impact hypothesis, which is the currently accepted theory, states that the moon formed when a Mars-sized object called Theia collided with Earth roughly 4.5 billion years ago. The debris from the impact coalesced into the moon. But this theory has issues. First, if the moon formed from Earth's debris, its composition should match Earth's composition. It doesn't. Lunar samples show a completely different ratio of isotopes, particularly oxygen isotopes, which suggests the moon didn't originate from Earth. Second, the moon's orbital mechanics don't fit the giant impact model. Computer simulations of the collision show that the debris would have formed a ring around Earth, not a single consolidated satellite. To get the moon into its current orbit, the simulations require multiple improbable adjustments that have never been observed in any other planetary system. And third, the moon is receding from Earth at a rate of 3.8 centimeters per year. If you reverse that recession, the moon would have been in contact with Earth roughly 1.4 billion years ago, not 4.5 billion years ago. The math doesn't work. In 1970, two Soviet scientists, Mikhail Vasin and Alexander Sherbakov, published a paper titled "Is the Moon the Creation of Alien Intelligence?" The paper was published in Sputnik, a Soviet science journal with international readership, and it laid out a detailed argument that the moon is an artificial structure. Vasin and Sherbakov weren't fringe researchers. They were members of the Soviet Academy of Sciences with backgrounds in astrophysics and engineering. They analyzed the same data that NASA had collected during the Apollo missions and concluded that the moon's size, orbit, density, and seismic properties were inconsistent with natural formation. They proposed that the moon is a hollow shell, possibly thousands of kilometers thick on the outside, but mostly empty on the inside, designed to house an advanced civilization or serve as a permanent base of operations for beings monitoring Earth. The paper meticulously documented anomalies. The moon's density is 3.34 grams per cubic centimeter. Earth's density is 5.5 grams per cubic centimeter. If the moon formed from the same material as Earth, the densities should be similar. They're not. The moon is too light for its size. Vasin and Sherbakov calculated that if the moon were a solid sphere of rock and metal matching its observed mass, it would have to be made of materials significantly less dense than anything found on Earth. The only explanation that fit the data was a hollow interior with a relatively thin outer shell. The paper was dismissed by mainstream scientists in the West as Soviet propaganda or scientific speculation. But it was never debunked. No one published a rebuttal that addressed the data. No one offered an alternative explanation that resolved the density problem or the seismic anomalies. The paper simply disappeared from academic discourse. The questions it raised are still unanswered 50 years later. The text describes previous civilizations that were given access to Anunnaki technology and destroyed themselves with it. The moon, the tablet claims, is both a gift and a test. If humanity can prove it's ready, the door will open. If not, it will remain sealed until we are. There's no way to verify the tablet's claims. We can't enter the moon. We can't scan its interior with enough precision to confirm or deny the existence of chambers, and we can't force NASA to release classified data from missions conducted over 50 years ago. But we can look at the evidence that's publicly available. The moon's unusual size and orbit, its hollow-sounding seismic behavior, the unexplained structures photographed by multiple missions, the consistent descriptions across ancient texts, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, and the fact that every time someone asks the hard questions, the answers are the same: natural formation, coincidence, lighting anomaly, move along. The tablet is still sitting in Berlin. You can request to view it if you go through the proper channels, though photography is restricted and access is limited. The translation has been peer-reviewed multiple times, and while some scholars argue about specific word choices, the overall meaning is consistent. The Sumerians believed the moon was hollow. They believed it was constructed, and they believed there was a door on its surface that led inside. Whether they were right is still an open question, but the fact that we're not allowed to ask it publicly should tell you something. If you want more breakdowns of ancient texts the establishment doesn't want you reading, subscribe now. Next week, I'm covering the Vedic scriptures that describe nuclear weapons in detail, including blast radius, fallout, and the long-term effects on the land, the kind of knowledge that shouldn't exist in texts written 3,000 years ago. The moon isn't going anywhere. It's still up there, still perfectly positioned, still ringing like a bell when we hit it. And somewhere on its surface, if the Sumerians were right, there's a door, waiting.